Country Music, Race, Gender and Transition in the Year of COVID-19. My name is Ben Atkinson. I'm a PhD music candidate at the University of Lincoln in the UK. So in this paper, I will examine the way in which COVID-19 and the pandemic have upended the US Country Music Awards season in 2020 and 2021, and the extent to which the crisis provided an opportunity for the country music industry to respond to the global social movements of Me Too and Black Lives Matter. In particular, I'll seek to establish the extent to which the decisions made by producers of the two flagship country music awards shows can be seen as an obvious alignment with these popular social movements, well known in the public consciousness and further highlighted by the impact of the pandemic. Or I will look to establish whether this is reflective of a trend in which the country music industry is moving away from its diversive past in relation to issues of race and gender. So some background then. In her book, The Selling Sound, The Rise of the Country Music Industry, Diane Pecknold describes how few expressions of popular culture have been shaped as strongly by the relationship between commercialisation and authenticity as country music. As early as the 1920s, thousands of listeners tuned in on their radio sets to be hypnotised by the yellow eye of a dial. The power of radio then was strong in the rural South in the first half of the 20th century. After all, it was the only form of entertainment that most families could afford. So before the radio, there was the rural house party, one of the great seedbeds of country music, but one where rural music remained an incurrent phenomenon which was as commercially successful as its socio-economic context would permit it to be. But all of this changed with the invention of the radio and then the arrival of the Grand Ole Opry, the flagship Saturday night show that became appointment listening for households across the rural southern United States. The Opry itself, though, was broadcast on Nashville's WSM radio station, and that's the call sign that stood for We Shield Millions, the slogan of the National Life and Accident Insurance Company. Now, they sold insurance and they saw a commercial opening in associating their business with a radio station that broadcast predominantly rural folk or country music. So it ushered in a new era, and in time the Opry became by far the biggest radio show in country music. Artists would perform radio spots sponsored by the likes of Mother's Best Flower, and which, as Havinghurst attests, was a 15-minute tour de force which married salesmanship and musicianship. Country music and commercial advertising then were now wedded together. So let's fast forward a little bit to 2020, and the Grand Ole Opry celebrated its 95th birthday amid the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. While still a historic institution, the Opry has arguably given way to country music awards shows as the commercialised bastion of the genre. With research from the sponsorship arm of the Country Music Association stating that the CMA Award viewers are 85% more likely to remember, seek out and try brands which they have seen on TV shows like these award programmes. In this way then, modern fans of country music are driven towards award shows like the CMAs, that's the Country Music Association Awards, and the ACMs, the Academy of Country Music Awards, which are often sponsored by related brands such as Ford and Chevrolet. And as I mentioned, they are 85% more likely to remember or seek out these brands. So the world goes into lockdown. At the same time as we're talking about, in March 2020, the world went into lockdown. It quickly became clear that large-scale events would not be happening and gatherings would not be able to take place. This had a particularly harsh impact on the music industry, of course, which relies on live concerts, national and international tours, and in-person award shows in order to be commercially successful. So research then from Cont'd outlines how the industry lost upwards of $30 billion in the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the crisis of the pandemic then didn't exclude award shows, which, as I've mentioned, they are usually big spectacle events with large crowds densely packed into big arenas. Clearly, they needed a different approach in light of COVID-19. And here are some photos of the Academy of Country Music Awards and the CMA Awards taking place before COVID-19. And you can see they're huge arena events with lots of people. At the same time as the pandemic threatened then to upend country music award shows, several notable social movements were also challenging the genre on its record of gender and racial biases. The Me Too movement caused us to look again at issues of gender discrimination towards women and associated sexual abuse. And moreover, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd by an on-duty police officer, Derek Chauvin, in May of 2020, the hashtag BLM, or Black Lives Matter campaign, quickly took hold across the world. And it shed a new light on many historically racist attitudes of the past and continuing racial biases of the present. In the country music genre, the Black Lives Matter movement had an immediate impact, bringing together and to the fore associations with slavery and the Civil War era terms of Dixie and antebellum. Now, Helegar describes this as the epitome of white America, a celebration of a Southern tradition that is indivisible from black slaves. In the months that followed then, the Dixie Chicks changed their name to the Chicks, Lady Antebellum became Lady A, and Dolly Parton renamed her Dixie Stampede at Dollywood. So, these two social movements were thrown into the spotlight during the pandemic, and a period when, due to lockdowns around the world, many more people remained at home and spent an increased amount of time consuming online and terrestrial media. During this period, then internet usage increased by between 50 and 70%, and streaming went up by at least 12%, according to Beach. In America and around the world, country music fans wondered, quite rightly, how the genre's two biggest events would go ahead in light of the pandemic. In addition, how would the CMAs and the ACMs reference the two social movements of Me Too and Black Lives Matter? So through the rest of this paper, then, I will examine the idea through two key case studies. Firstly, the ACMs from 2020 and 2021, their coverage and their groundbreaking choice of presenter and location. Secondly, the CMA Awards, which took place in November of 2020, where the Country Music Association became embroiled in a controversy around their COVID-19 precautions for an in-person awards show. And here are two photographs of what the award shows looked like during the pandemic, and you can see they are very, very different, not only from each other, but also from the photographs you saw previously of the pre-pandemic shows as well. So my first case study then looks at the Academy of Country Music Awards. They were the first to respond to the pandemic, with their show in April of 2020 being moved from a large arena in Las Vegas to a series of three historic venues in Nashville, namely the Ryman Auditorium, the Bluebird Cafe and the Grand Ole Opry. In addition, the show was broadcast without an audience for the very first time in its history. And in staging the show in this way, the ACM successfully retained an element of the glamour and excitement usually associated with the awards. This helped to some extent to distract from the sudden impact of the pandemic. It was notable though as well because the 55th ACM Awards became the first major in-person awards event to take place in the USA since the outbreak of COVID-19. Prior to that, everything had been happening in lockdown. 2020 then was also important for other reasons, not only because it proved that a large industry-wide awards event like this could take place in a socially distanced fashion at the height of the pandemic, but also because of the show's focus on female performers, a trend that has been building in country music for some time, certainly in awards programming anyway. For example, the show featured a celebration of the Opry's 95th birthday, a medley of songs that was performed by Carrie Underwood, while Miranda Lambert won her 35th CMA or ACM award, extending her record as the most awarded person in ACM history. Interestingly, the show that week featured the first ACM Awards tie when Carrie Underwood and Thomas Rhett were jointly awarded the Entertainer of the Year trophy. At the time, even Carrie Underwood herself expressed shock at this, saying, "We kept asking the accounting firm Deloitte, 'Are you sure? Are you sure?'" And while the ACMs have clearly taken steps towards making their awards show more inclusive for female artists, the fact that they chose to award a tie and to present the awards to the male artist first in that situation rather than to both artists together shows that the genre still has a lot of room for improvement. Okay. Now, while the ACM award winners in 2021 were much more positive, probably, for female artists, they had 43% of nominees who were female that year, the year after. A number of these nominations greatly improved on previous 5-year average for the Academy, which was only 34%, so it increased by upwards of about 12 or 13% year on year. As the pandemic continued for a second consecutive year, the ACMs decided to hold their ceremony in Nashville again, repeating their successful formula. And moreover, the Academy made what can only be described as a groundbreaking decision when they decided to announce Mickey Guyton would join Keith Urban as the host for the 2021 ceremony. In doing so, Guyton became the first black woman to ever host a Country Music Awards show. Now, to establish the reason why Guyton as a host for the ACM Awards is quite a unique choice, alongside the more conventional choice, I guess, of Keith Urban, we need to look at some of the historical context in which the country music genre exists. So let's look a little at the history of race in country music. Angela Hammond has called country a racialised music, which, according to music journalist and author Edward Morris, is fundamentally based on the white experience. The genre has then long had issues with race, despite a multiplicity of ethnic influences, participants and consumers. Now, indeed, while country music has developed out of a need for Americans, especially those who felt left out and looked down upon, to tell their stories, one of its earliest instruments, in fact, was the banjo, and that one was brought by slaves from Africa. As Rhiannon Giddens points out, this music then is America, but it's got Africa in it. The irony in that lies in the fact that the banjo quickly became the instrument of choice for early country performers who were almost without exception white. And in doing so, it played into the assumption that Morris and Hammond have already explored, that despite country music historian Bill Malone suggesting that you cannot conceive of country music existing without this African-American infusion. So country music's relationship with race has always been a challenging one. In the 1920s, D. Ford Bailey became the pioneer of the Grand Ole Opry and the show's first black star. He performed what he called black hillbilly music. Aside from Bailey, for many, Charley Pride is considered to be country music's only black superstar. Although in recent years there have been other notable black performers in the genre, including Darius Rucker, Jimmy Allen, Kane Brown, Rhiannon Giddens and Mickey Guyton, to date, no other black country singer has ever approached Pride's commercial achievements. In this arena then, the decision to name not only a woman, but a black woman as a host for the ACM Awards takes on a much more symbolic meaning. Consider this alongside the fact that Guyton would be hosting across a number of the most historic venues in Nashville. Traditionally, those venues have acted as a beacon for segregated modes of consumption in which white audiences could consume appropriations of black culture, and you can start to see why Guyton's hosting duties can be considered a watershed moment in the country music genre. Across a 2-year period then, and one which has been dominated by the ongoing pandemic, the ACMs have taken some dramatic action on their need to address gender and racial inequality in their programming. This has clearly garnered more attention than it might otherwise have done without the pandemic. Audiences and critics alike were keen to see how the show would play out in a new format, which I would argue placed the ACMs on a pedestal and provided an even greater opportunity for them to be seen around the world, and for Guyton's role to be shared around the world as well. However, it's hard to see how the events that unfolded in 2020 and 2021 could not have been influenced by BLM, albeit to a lesser extent Me Too as well. The ACMs have had at least one female host in 36 of their 56-year history, although most of those were Reba McEntire, with a total of 17 out of 36. But aside from Guyton, the show has only twice ever been hosted by a black artist, and that was Charley Pride in 1980 and 1984, and it's never been hosted by a black woman, as we have seen. So the murder of George Floyd then, and the social movement that followed, provided the perfect opportunity to address a decades-old racial bias in country music awards programming, and the crisis of the pandemic clearly brought this issue to the fore, and it's hard not to see the choice of Guyton as a host as a reaction to the wide-reaching Black Lives Matter movement. So my second case study then looks at the CMA Awards. By November 2020, having seen how the ACMs had reacted to the pandemic by moving their show to Nashville, it was the turn of the CMA Awards. And the CMA Awards presented their response by virtue of the fact that the ACM Awards take place in April and the CMAs take place in November. The 2020 CMA Awards would, rightly or wrongly, be judged against the success of the ACM's move to Nashville. So it's for this reason that the two shows have always kept some distance from each other, often pointedly so. The CMAs are always held in Nashville, and the ACMs have always been held traditionally anywhere but, owing mostly to the fact that the organisation was founded in 1964 as the Country and Western Music Academy, and it sought to promote the country music made in the Western states, California and those places, in contrast to the sounds made in Nashville. The CMAs then, in stark contrast to the ACMs, was held in a socially distanced way with a limited audience. It was just made up of performers and nominees, but aside from the socially distanced tables and the requirement for those in the audience to wear a mask, the only notable difference really from a normal CMA show was that it was moved to a smaller venue. The CMAs are usually held in the huge big Bridgestone Arena. Television coverage from the venue they chose, Music City Centre, was a very subdued affair, in stark contrast to the big awards show in an arena of 2019, and also in contrast to the ACM's historic Nashville bent of earlier in the year. Now, while the CMAs did not initially make headlines for their in-person staging during the pandemic, their choice of honoree for the Willie Nelson Lifetime Achievement Award definitely stood out, and they chose to give this award to Charley Pride. As I've already discussed, Charley Pride is one of the most revered artists in country music history, and the genre's most prominent and, for many years only, black performer. Pride would be the 6th recipient of this award and the first black artist to be given it. The fact that it took 8 years from the award being introduced for a black artist to be presented with it, and that this award was presented to country's most prominent non-white artist in the same year that the Black Lives Matter movement took hold around the world, should probably be more closely examined outside of this paper. This in itself then marks Pride out as an interesting choice by the CMA, and again it's one that arguably received more press coverage and scrutiny in light of the pandemic. Pride was invited to attend the ceremony, and he did so. He performed that night. However, just weeks after attending the televised event, the 86-year-old Pride died on December the 12th from complications of COVID-19. Having managed to avoid any major controversies associated with their response to the pandemic so far, Pride's death sent shockwaves through the country music industry, not least because of his advanced age and, of course, his legendary status, I should say. This called into question the protocols that the CMA had put in place around their awards, and even more pointed is the fact that most of the immediate criticism came from a group of female artists. And they were Maren Morris, Brandi Carlile, Rissy Palmer, and the aforementioned Mickey Guyton, who have all expressed their own forms, all have experienced their own forms of discrimination in the genre, be it for their race, sexuality, or gender. Now, at the height of the controversy, the CMA themselves released a statement, and they said, quote, Charley was tested prior to travelling to Nashville. He was tested upon landing in Nashville, and again on the show day, with all the tests coming back negative. After returning to Texas following the CMA Awards, Charley was again tested negative multiple times. The statement was later corroborated by Pride's long-term manager and bass player, Kevin Bailey. But as Yar suggests, however, while it's unclear where Pride contracted COVID-19, many of the viewers of the show were shocked to see the ceremony taking place indoors, in front of nearly 100 people, the majority of whom were not actually wearing their masks when they were on camera. In addition, Yar goes on to question the strange tone of the CMA Awards, the format's biggest night in the national spotlight, to celebrate a music genre that is known for captivating real life and what they call three-quarters of the truth, trying to project an image of cheerful normalcy in a tragedy-filled year. And they question whether the CMA should have better reflected the pandemic. Behind the scenes then, the CMA Awards have been rightly questioned for their decision to hold an in-person awards ceremony, and from many critics, they have used the term tone deaf to describe their attempt at normalcy. So to conclude then, clearly 2020 was a unique year around the world, and no less so in country music, for all the reasons that I've outlined. It's unlikely that things will be as negatively impacted in this way again. Although the ACMs repeated their successful COVID-informed approach in April 2021, on reflection, the decision was more likely a product of the continuing travel ban within the US and the slow vaccine rollout than the severity of the pandemic itself, just to be safe. The show was markedly different then in social form, in that it had a socially distanced audience. Members were invited to all venues to watch and applaud the show. And also in the US, music is now starting to open up again, with tours and live events being announced for the autumn of 2021. So the pandemic does seem to have introduced some change, if not long-term positive action on race and gender, then certainly in affording country music an opportunity to revisit and reevaluate its roots. The responses that I have described in here do feel more like an informed reaction to the Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movements, and as such, they may not persist into the future. But the way that country music is changing is positive, and it suggests a more inclusive marrying of the conservative past with new, more open approaches for the future. So the 2021 ACM Awards, for example, saw traditional country legend Alan Jackson invited to perform an original song of his for the first time in 10 years. In addition, artists have used their time in lockdown to reflect on how their career might develop in the future. Male artist Thomas Rhett recorded more fiddle songs on his album Country Again Side A, and Miranda Lambert released an album of acoustic campfire songs recorded live on location in Marfa, Texas. And this record, it has been noted, probably would not have been released before COVID. Both of these projects then are likely to do well at the CMA Awards in November 21, further solidifying the pandemic's impact, namely that country musicians have clearly been reflecting on themselves as much as anyone else has been this last year. Overall, it'll be interesting to see how the pandemic has impacted the genre of country music more widely over the coming years, and to closely examine the extent of the impact of the genre's two flagship award shows and the impact they've had on race and gender biases in the genre. This is particularly true when, by virtue of the pandemic, they have cast even more of a spotlight on the decisions to name the first black female performer and host of an award show, and the first black performer to be presented with the Lifetime Achievement Award as well. Moreover, it now seems that gender and racial biases in country music are even more overtly visible than ever, and in this way, the crisis of the pandemic has certainly helped to move forward action on the two most diversive inequalities which have blighted country music for decades. Thank you very much. These are my references from this presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions.